Explain, a little bit about your background. You're at such a cool mix here. Jason is the CEO of Carbon Asset Solutions, and he came from an agricultural college, just before that, and so that's how I had met him. And he's got such a unique perspective, especially being from Canada. You just want to go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit?
Thank you, brother, American brother from another mother. I'll give you a quick bio of me, just because I think some of you know each other, but I haven't had the privilege to get to know all of you yet. So I have a non-linear career path, is the easiest way to explain it. My first 10 years I spent in high tech. So I was a senior project manager in new product introduction at the world's fourth largest telecommunications company. It was called Nortel. It was Canada's biggest company. It imploded, but that happened after my story. So I spent 10 years there. That's my technology background. But in my DNA, like most of us here, somewhere in there is this love of ranching and livestock and making, growing food. And so some friends of ours had bought this big ranch, and I went out to visit them, and I looked at the top of the hill looking down on the ranch, and I said to my friend Don, "Ooh, this place is awesome. If you ever need a ranch manager, let me know." Then I went back to the city and was doing my thing, and he called me up a year later, and he said, "When you said that, were you serious?" And I'm like, "Yes." And so I left my career job at this company and took my young family out to manage the Bar 75, the Red Deer River Ranch. It's a 50,000 acre, lots of government land and private land, 350 head cow-calf operation. No neighbors, no full-time neighbors. My nearest neighbor lived across the river. He rode to work a horseback when he came to work for me, and his wife came across on the cable car across the river, so that and it was a cool gig for sure. So I spent 20 years in the back of a horse learning about livestock production. And I see some FFA, right? Back there. So, do you have 4-H as well? Okay, so the 4-H model is learn to do by doing. I'm the poster boy for learn to do by doing because I had never calved a cow on my own yet. And here I was, so I did that, and for 20 years though, I felt like I was beating my head against the wall because I couldn't make the business model work there. And the owner was a very successful entrepreneur and financier, but we kept trying to break it down into silos like conventional thinking, conventional industrial production model thinking. And right before when I left 3 years before that, I finally figured out I wasn't running it as a system. So I did a lot of reading and research and found out about people like Gabe Brown and created an adaptive multi-paddock grazing system and a gravity-fed water system, and in 3 years increased the forage utilization and production with no synthetic inputs by 300%. And so I was like, okay. And then an instructor at a college found out about what I was doing and took her class there, and she said, "Hey, we're hiring a contract instructor. You should come." So I went to Olds College for one class, one semester, which turned into a career there, where I helped to design the smart farm and helped to stand that whole thing up. And then one of the projects that was the technology that was going to be implemented in a project on the smart farm at Olds College was mobile inelastic neutron scattering, MINS, and the company was Carbon Asset Solutions. So I was helping them get the project sort of oriented and helping them with some standing up the business, and they kept saying to me, "You should come work for us." And so they convinced me, and I left my career at Olds College to take over as the president of Carbon Asset Solutions, where we measure soil carbon at the atomic level. We measure the additionality of that, and then we include the farmer and the rancher as part of that partnership, and they get to have 60% of the sale price of the carbon when we forward sell that on the carbon market. So that's my non-linear career path. I took way longer than I should have, but it's great to meet you all. Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming down, Jason. It hasn't been easy to travel back and forth between Canada for the last couple of years. So for the next discussion, I'm going to try and have this be a little bit more autonomous, but it will be healthy soils equal healthy humans. So Dave, you want to maybe start us off down there on maybe some of the high-level conclusions, from your book on why healthy soils equals healthy humans.
Sure. I mean, we've focused in agriculture for the last century virtually on maximizing yield, on maximizing production. And as we did that through crop breeding or changes in practices, we really took our eye off of what's in our food, essentially the nutritional content of it. And when we have focused on the nutritional content, we've focused mostly on macronutrients and on like proteins, carbohydrates, fats, without getting into the other things like mineral micronutrients, the phytonutrients that Gabe was talking about. Vitamins, of course, have been looked at a bit more as well. But when you think in the world of nutrition about what relates to health, you can think of two conditions of health. One is being alive. At some level, that's healthy. And that's where we need yield for, right? We need enough calories to survive. But then there's whether or not we're thriving, and that's where the real emphasis on health, I think, is. And the more that we've learned in the last 80 years about sort of what it takes to run a human body well and let it thrive, the more we've learned about the importance of mineral micronutrients and phytochemicals, and vitamins as well, and things that are now being called longevity vitamins that are not really recognized as vitamins, but that in the medical literature, there's documented connections to human health. And in particular, all those things, the micronutrients, vitamins, phytochemicals, they relate to suppression of chronic diseases. Why? Because they are things like anti-inflammatories, and they have antioxidant effects. You can think of, and I like to think of it in an analogy that Anne will not let me use in the book because she doesn't like to write about cars, but I like to think of those things as sort of the oil that helps keep our bodies running. And the calories are the gasoline, but we also need the oil that keeps the engine working well so it can burn the gasoline. And that's how I sort of think of mineral micronutrients and phytochemicals, is that we need them for our bodies to run well, for our immune systems to be teed up to deal with external challenges. And that also translates over into the fat profiles of meat and dairy in terms of the omega-3 and omega-6 content. And it turns out that the reason that there's differences in the composition of foods, of animal products raised on different feeds, what our food ate, relates to what's actually in a seed versus what's in a leaf. Think about what a seed does. It's a storage element. It's full of what are known as omega-6 fats, because those resist breakdown, they store really well, they last a long time. They're great if you want to ship something. They're not so good in your body, though, because they are also the seed fats for triggering inflammation. And that's not 100% across the board. Some of them actually turn into anti-inflammatory compounds, but if your body is overloaded with omega-6s, you're teed up to actually trigger inflammation fairly readily. Omega-3 fats are very enriched in things that photosynthesize. They are a much more unstable and dynamic fat that decays faster. They go rancid faster. But they're also in the human body, and they're in leaves because they're involved in photosynthesis. And so in supporting photosynthesis, if I'm remembering it right. And what they do in the human body is they are also key precursors to compounds that help quell or turn off inflammation. So when we went to raising animals in ways where they're fed dominantly on seed-derived products, corn and soy-fed cattle, we basically overloaded their bodies with omega-6 fats and stripped out the omega-3s from their diet. And what did that do? There's a whole slew of what are known as feedlot diseases that are rooted in inflammation that are probably a result of that. What has it done in our bodies? Well, that's still a bit of an open question, but what happened to human health after the Second World War when these big changes in agriculture came down the pipe? Chronic diseases went through the roof. We became very good at treating acute diseases with modern medicine, but we didn't understand the connections to limiting and managing chronic diseases. So those are the kind of connections in terms of how agriculture would map into the health space through the lens that Ann and I have sort of charted the connections between. We've basically turned down a whole suite of compounds that we don't need to survive. They're not really nutrients in the classical definition, but they're actually central to maintaining health.
And maybe, Joni, I'd like to follow up from that, Dave. How do you see the healthcare industry evolving, I guess, when we're talking about, soil health and human health. I guess somebody who's been in the industry and now you're in food and ag, like where do you see that conversation going and how do you see it going?
Well, I have to say in the last 15 years, there's been a massive metamorphosis in thinking about diet as foundational to health, even in conventional classic Western medicine circles. I honestly can say that when I was in nursing school, I went to nursing school in upstate New York too, so it was kind of a different population of people. I'd never lived on the East Coast and I kind of wanted an adventure. I'm like, why not? Let's go to New York. And it was like total junk food all the time, and you'd get ostracized if you brought hippie food, and ate it in the nurses' lounge. And it was back in the days also when the pharmaceutical companies would bring in lunch every day, and they finally made that illegal because I was working in a cath lab, and every day it would be like the most incredible buffet of like chicken Alfredo and like stuff that would put you in the cath lab in a hurry if you ate it every day. I was like, this is kind of weird. Is anybody making the connection? And so I think that there's been a huge shift in medical providers in the last 10 years especially, and we're getting there. But I think right now they're kind of at level one where they're looking at, I'm really looking at my nutritional profile and I'm thinking about what I'm eating and I'm doing trend diets. Well, that's the gateway drug to thinking about food and health. So I'm glad they're on stage one, but they haven't taken it to the next level. And I think that is in part because the food system doesn't invite them into that process. And that's something that we think snacktivism should be, is that pathway for learning to consumers. I'm really passionate about how can we get a label on the package that starts talking about phytochemicals and starts talking about nutrition profiles that are beyond just the macros and the typical suspects we see on a nutritional profile. How can we put a biodiversity index or a carbon sequestration value or a water impact value on our packaging? Once we start doing that, and we're hoping we'll be the first, we're going to try to release this by next year, yikes, but just to start the dialogue, to make it a thing that people start to think about. Because once you introduce them to a new way of looking at the world, like what Gabe was thinking about earlier and talking about, it's mindset. It all has to do with mindset. And when you're battling reductionistic thinking as an institutional overlay to all facets of our world, from economics to food systems to health, the very first step is just going to get people to step back and look at things a little differently. So I think the food industry has a huge call to action to try to push people to start thinking about this and making soil and the soil rhizosphere and the microbiome of our gut and of our environment are very closely correlated. And that's a whole topic that's also waking up. The concept of probiotics is becoming more commonplace, but we're not there yet, but we're getting there. I know Gabe and probably has something to say about this.
Gabe, I'd like to ask you to follow up on your teaspoon of 4 billion microorganisms, and how significant is that? There's only one person I know that has really hooked or landed or worked with kind of a major operator like General Mills. And so how has that evolved? How have you got to this point, and how significant is it to them?
That's quite a question there. So I'm going to ignore that and talk about what I'm kidding you. Fact of the matter is, I spend the majority of my time now talking with CEOs, board of directors of large corporations. And the reason being is that if we're going to truly make meaningful change, I've spent the last 20 plus years talking to individual farmers and ranchers, and it's what I love to do, but we have to get all of society involved. And if we can get these larger companies involved, we're going to drive change quicker on the landscape, as David said, the change that's really needed. Now, these companies have a marketing budget that is next to none, but also they have a research budget. And they're researching what is the latest trend, okay? You want to know the number one for the last 3 years, what's number one on their list for what's trending in the food industry? Cheetos. No. Genomes, did you say?
Keto.
Keto. No, okay. It's regenerative ag. Number one is regenerative ag. And so these companies, now on that note, most of the major companies have made sustainability claims. We're going to help move X number of acres to regenerative farming. Well, they're not going to do that without the farmers or ranchers. Okay, they know the consumers are starting to demand regeneratively grown and raised products. And these companies, where are they going to get those products from? So it's become a driving force of us. How do we connect this? Common ground, common good. Okay, they need the products grown and raised regeneratively. We know the farmers and ranchers that are doing that, and we have the ability to educate them. But in turn, though, they have to be able to help in that education component of these farmers and ranchers, okay? A lot of companies for a long time, and you know, I'm a capitalist, I want people to make money, but we've got to do it in a way that's equitable, that realize farmers and ranchers, if they go down the regenerative path, as Dr. Montgomery said, they're providing products that are higher in these phytochemical compounds, okay, but they're also doing all these other services that were talked about here. More carbon, clean water, clean air. So how do we come together as a society, you know, for the betterment of all? And I think the important link in all of this is the human health component. Because all of us, now I know when you look at me, you just think of health, right? Come on. Okay, but fact of the matter is, and Jason knows this, David knows this, you know, fact of the matter is, rarely do I eat out when I travel. I bring my food with me. I eat what I grow and raise. I ate the meal here today because I knew it would be high quality, okay? The other thing you might know about me is I literally don't sleep a whole lot, okay? So I've been awake longer than any 95-year-old person out there, I'll guarantee you that. But what allows for that? Okay, I told you how many flights I was on, how many travel days, all through COVID and that. I just don't get sick. It just doesn't affect me, but it's because of that biology in the soil. It's because of these phytochemical compounds in the foods that are grown and raised on our ranch. And matter of fact, in the new book coming out by Dr. Montgomery, he talks in there about how the beef on our ranch, the tests that were done, tests higher in omega-3s than does wild salmon. Okay, think about that one once. So the fact of the matter is, it's what's in the soil and that life in the soil that creates a healthy gut microbiome.
And so, Jason, I'd like to follow up with you. One of the unique positions that you're in, and the United States is actually, we're way behind in this when it comes to the carbon markets. And so in order to improve soil density, biology, you kind of got to have incentives, you know, to help spur this along. And so would you want to talk about how you think the carbon markets are supposed to function, and how they're working in Canada to maybe and try to correlate that? So I know it's kind of a tough question, but there's definitely a correlation between incentives and farmers actually going out to integrate and deploy these soil health improving principles.
So I'm not sure I understand how they're supposed to function. I think I know how they might function or how they should, which I hope that it's more of a free market economy, to be quite honest, and that it's driven by need and desire from people, companies, some of the ones probably that Gabe talked about, and others that want to buy high quality carbon credits. In Canada, we have a different taxation regime right now. We have a $50 a ton, actually just went up 3 weeks ago to $50 a ton as a tax. I happen to think that carbon tax is really inefficient. Our current government's talking about $170 a ton carbon tax by 2030. So that's like 8 years away. what that tells me and my colleagues, and I think should tell us, is that there's a desire by governments, at least, and I think even companies that talk about their ESG targets, understanding that there's going to be some sort of regulatory regime or tax that's driving the carbon market. But I actually think it's going to be driven by the companies that really want, because you can't save your way to net zero, right? You can't just keep reducing. We all need to eat, we all need energy, we all need those type of things. So there's going to be a need still for companies to have to purchase a carbon credit to help them get to net zero. I'm okay with the term net zero. I actually much prefer the idea of a circular economy, because that's more of what it is to me. So, but incentives, so I don't think, like, tax to me is a stick at best, and it's a nasty stick, and I don't think it works very well. I'm not sure there's other good incentives. What should be what I've seen from producers that I know personally, or people that I've read about, that are focusing on functional soil health first, which is driving their profitability. And some of the investors that I'm talking to with our company, and even some of our team, are like, well, no, but we're about selling carbon credits, and we have to, the farmers they're gonna wanna do this just because they want a carbon credit. I'm like, no. The ones that I know that have really made a change, one of my close friends, I won't use his name, but worked with him for the last quite a few years, he's focusing first on functional soil health in his regenerative practice, and then profitability. And I've talked to others about that as well. And then we talk about the carbon market, and people go, oh yeah, I should probably think about that. So it becomes almost like a secondary or tertiary thing. So the incentive is about creating a resiliency in your business. There's resiliency that comes from regenerative agriculture, but that has to be your business, and the incentive needs to be profitability and functional soil health. And then when I think, well, how does that relate to human health, which is what we're all talking about, is we need to measure and quantify that. And there's some ways out there to do that right now. But we need to know, well, what is my hypothesis is, and I put this out there, and then I'll welcome discussion after, is that carbon is the apex measurement of functional soil health. There's lots of other things we need to look at in terms of measuring soil, like nutrients and microbial life, and like the Haney soil test, for instance, and those type of things. Look at what's happening in the soil. So we need to measure different things. It's like when we go to the doctor, we get our blood checked and our urine checked, and we get blood pressure, and if you have something specific, you get an MRI. And I think the incentive for the producer then becomes, well, how healthy is my soil from where is the carbon at, and what do I need to do to continue to improve that system? But if they can also get paid $100 a ton or $150 a ton for the carbon that they're sequestering in their soil, in their system, that will be an incentive as well, because that drives the bottom line. And so, but it should be done, we should all want to do well by doing good. That's where I think the incentive should be. And I don't think it's going to be as much regulatory driven, at least I hope not. So.
And are you guys prototyping up there in Canada, and are you looking for partners down here in the United States?
So this year, in North America, we've got 3 of our MINS units up and going. There's actually one in Alabama with 2 of my partners right now at the USDA National Soil Dynamics Lab, it's their technology that we just happen to get the patent and commercialize. And so we're doing a 50,000 acre proof of concept commercialization rollout. It's basically phase 1 commercialization. So 40,000 acres in the US and 10,000 in Canada. So those are our we'll have 4 of the MINS carts ready to go, and they're going to be commercially available to scan acres, and we're looking for farmers to enter into a relationship with in terms of a contract, scanning your soil, giving you you basically get a carbon yield map. So those of you that farm, you're probably used to seeing a yield map off your combine. We provide that in terms of carbon. And so I'm part of the reason I came down here was to meet folks around here and next door in Oregon to talk about acres that we want to scan and enter into. It's a long-term relationship. It sounds it's kind of touchy-feely, but it is that way. We want to, because the way we built our model is that we all benefit when everybody does well.
Yeah, and I can appreciate that. I mean, we call it the Carbon Summit, but I talk about it in the context that I'm a carbon being on a carbon planet, and carbon is the energy molecule, but the carbon markets are very, very confusing still for a lot of people. And so, you know, just seeing how Canada's working on it, United States, we can't make up our mind on which way to go, I think a lot of the ways. But in terms of your book, Dave, I think, what would you say was there anything interesting that you had found out about, you know, the correlation between soil health and human health? I mean, that's a big question, but it's such a, I mean, the book's not out yet, so I guess I can't say I've read it and can ask you some really pointed question towards it.
Yeah, well, you know, one of the things that really struck me in reading it, being sort of a bit of a student of history, and geology is one of these historical sciences, and the sequence in which things happen turn out to influence the possibilities for what comes next. One of the things that really impressed me in the book, well, I'll mention two things, but one that impressed me a lot that I really wasn't prepared to learn, but in hindsight it's not that surprising, is just how much of the insight from the 1920s, 30s, and early part of the 40s in terms of people looking at the changes that were sweeping through agriculture at the time and raising sort of yellow flags of going, but what about, you know, the nutritional quality of our food? What about the state of our soil? Just how much their insights, which were empirically based, they were based on seeing land be degraded, seeing sheep get sick after eating the wrong, you know, stuff grown what they thought was the wrong way. How much of their insights have actually been elaborated on and demonstrated the basis for it in the scientific community in a way that hasn't really fed back into the agronomic community. And that to me was really intriguing and interesting, and there's a whole, you know, someone could do a whole PhD thesis on why, but I think it boils down to lack of understanding of the mechanisms. And we're at the point now where I think we understand the mechanisms enough to have a fresh look at it and try and resynthesize the connections, because they are complicated and they are going to play out uniquely in individuals. But at the public health level across broad populations, I think it's fairly easy to try to draw those threads together and make recommendations for what would be better policies going forward at a very general level. You know, and I kind of hoped that we'd get to some kind of, you know, when you start researching a book, you kind of hope you'll have a message like that in the end. But we went down into the weeds and then pulled that message up from the weeds, so we're pretty confident of it. The other thing that I was actually even more surprised by is how much research was done in the 40s and 50s that demonstrated the effects of overuse of nitrogen fertilizers, in particular on the mineral micronutrient content of foods. And then there's also the connections, perhaps the most surprising stuff, to give you a third one, or connections that have come out of understanding human biology and the immune system in more detail, the connections between flavor and the nutritional qualities of food. That flavorless tomato that you're all familiar with, that we've all inadvertently sampled from the grocery store, really does have less of the health imbuing phytochemicals and the phytonutrients than the really rich, flavorful ones. And there's been good studies that have looked at those connections and how that translates. You have taste receptors throughout your body. We know of the ones in our mouths, but it turns out most of the major organs in our bodies have similar taste receptors, and those are there not to give us a sense of flavor in our liver, but to inform our body about what's in the food that we're consuming. And so there's a very strong evolutionary case to be made, again, where the geology comes back in as being actually useful. There's a very strong evolutionary case to be made for why foods, sort of fresh whole foods that taste good, are actually better for us. And there's a real argument to be made that we make in the book that the modern food processing industry that has essentially substituted very flavorful things for very healthful flavorful things are kind of deceiving our taste buds into convincing our bodies that we want to eat a whole lot of foods that aren't necessarily good for us. So it's an invitation to rethink how we think about food.
Does that go carry forward with like impossible meats and beyond?
the question was, does that carry forward with like Impossible Meats and sort of the synthetic or faux meat products? You know, I'm not aware of studies that have looked at that directly that I could find. I know some studies that are in progress that are looking at things like that. The answer I would offer would depend an awful lot on how the pea protein or the other ingredients are raised that go into that. And that's often something that's left off the table. But they could be raised regeneratively. So I'm going to give you sort of a solid, well, it probably depends in terms of the details. But in terms of any highly processed food, of which those are good examples, the nature of the ingredients used in the processing is really going to matter to the outcome of the answer to your question.
I have a 2-year-old's answer for your question. So I have a 2-year-old grandson, coolest kid on the planet, and I'm a proud granddad. So he can't stop eating strawberries in our backyard, right? He picks them off the plant. He could hardly walk, and he was eating strawberries. The first time that my daughter gave him a strawberry from the grocery store, he spit it out. And we're like, whoa, he wouldn't eat it. He will only eat strawberries that taste like that. And he's 2.
Yeah, his body knows what to do.
Smart.
And Joni, I have a follow-up. Do you see Joni just started a podcast. I was fortunate enough to be on that when we were in Chico at a Soil Health Academy. Gabe, we could hear him preaching in the background a little bit. And do you feel like there's a food renaissance, kind of coming, especially around those foundational foods that you were talking about?
Yeah, definitely. There is a huge renaissance coming. And it's interesting because I think a lot of the times it's like human nature to have a more pessimistic lens looking at a huge disruptive event. And right now we have a trifecta of pressures that are building towards a massively disruptive event, being climate-driven change, global economic supply chain, and pandemics, both from the ones like we just experienced over the last 2 years, but also from diet-related disease. And when I look at the business landscape of food, to me, that is the biggest opportunity that we've had in 100 years. But when you talk to other people, they're like, oh, well, that's really risky. Like, what do you mean you're creating a new category? Like, yikes. Like, that sounds really scary. And I'm like, well, is that what you guys told Steve Jobs back like 30 years ago? Is that what you told Elon a couple decades ago? Like, you guys missed the boat and you're still mad about that, and now you're doing it again. So that's the way I feel about it when it comes to opportunity and renaissance. But, foundational foods have long been, subject to the forces of the commodity market. And as my dad long said, when I was like, hey, I'd be interested in going into agriculture, he's like, what the hell are you thinking? Like, don't you know that's the only industry in America that is free from free market pressure or choice? It's not actually even capitalistic anymore. It's totally run by multinational corporations and the government. And I'm like, oh, ew. Maybe I'll go into healthcare or something. So, it's kind of an interesting thought, like, when you think about it like that. So as we have a decentralization, which is a very disruptive thing, where we move away from these highly centralized, vertically integrated mega business models, and we see a reflourishing of like the middle class of the food sector, that is a massive opportunity that will impact rural economics, because they've had an extinction period that's been significant the last couple decades as well. But that will ultimately affect like the palate of our country. Like, I think it will open a lot of people's minds to flavor. Flavor usually brings forth nutrition. And then we have that whole tech overlay, which has the sexiness factor that all young people love when you throw carbon in the equation. And I think it sets up a total renaissance of reevaluating like boring foods through a whole new lens. Like boring foods like wheat, poor wheat. It's not boring at all. If you read into the history of it and the agronomy and the complexity, it's like one of the most fascinating crops on earth.
It's what we've done to it.
Thank you, Gabe. It's what we've done to it that's so sad and a tragedy. So as I work with farmers that are like true visionaries, like Don and Dick Sherman in Eastern Washington at Palouse Heritage Farms, I mean, they're like revolutionaries in their own right, and going out and preserving all these like lost seeds. Or my friend Chef Pierre Chiam, who's from Senegal, who's working in rural Sahel to like try to preserve lost millet genetic biodiversity so we can bring back that biodiversity to a very stagnant category, and that's going to turn it upside down. It's a fun place to be working, but it's still a big challenge.
I just got to add, what else will that biodiversity then do? The biodiversity of those seeds will change the biodiversity in the soil.
Yep.
You know, and we forget about that. You know, you walk into a supermarket and 80% of the products in that supermarket have ingredients from 10 specific crops. That's just wrong. That's not the way we ate in the past.
And so when it comes, oh, go ahead.
When we go to the supermarket, should we always buy organic food?
Go ahead, Gabe. Or
That's you. Yeah, you don't want to get me started.
I've heard Gabe talk about this topic before. It's kind of fun. Honestly, I am very leery of the amount of petrochemical additives we're putting on our food right now. So in that sense of the argument, if you're trying to avoid chemicals, yes, organic's a great purchase. And if you're sensitive to glyphosate, even if you buy organic stuff, it's blowing in from the neighbor's fields. So even organic in this country, when they try to export it to Europe, it gets turned around at the port and sent back because it still has glyphosate residue all over it. So, I think that there is a common ground between regenerative and organic. Granted, actually being regenerative and organic at the same time is very, very difficult because of tillage and because of a number of other things. And
You don't have to till an organic.
yeah, so it's an emerging discourse, and I get in the middle of the mudflinging quite frequently, and I'm just trying to stay neutral on we need both movements and we need them to work together. And yeah, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I get caught in the mudslinging too on this one. In part, because if you look at the retrospective studies that have compared organic and conventional produce and the nutritional quality of it as advertised by the authors of those studies, the one common element that you see across those studies is that organic foods have lower pesticide contents, not a big surprise there, but they also tend to have higher phytochemical density. And those phytonutrients that Gabe and I were talking about tend to be higher in organic foods. Almost every comparison has done that. And what would the root of that be? Probably soil life. There's a lot of good studies that have shown that organic practices can be good at building soil life. Now, on the other hand, I wrote a whole book, Dirt, about how farming practices before Monsanto existed, farming practices that were organic practices, destroyed the soil in regions all around the world. So in that sense, I kind of get caught between those worlds. And what I like to argue for is that the metric we really ought to be looking for in our farming practices is soil health and the effect on the land. And unfortunately, so far, there's not a really good label that singles that out. That said, what do Ann and I do for our food? We go to farmers markets and buy as much as we can from farmers who we know what they're doing. If I'm out of town and I walk into a grocery store at the moment, the one signal I have at a grocery store is organic versus conventional, and I'll go organic. Because, I'd rather not have the pesticides, and on average, they're probably doing better than conventional on soil health. That said, I've been on farms in California that are organic farms that are huge, that just till the hell out of their land, and they've burned through almost all their organic matter. They're organic, so there's probably not much in the way of pesticides, but there's not much in the way of soil health either. So I tend to argue that both the conventional farming world and the organic farming world have work to do in terms of how to figure out how to be more regenerative in both spheres. And in the organic world, it's how to get off of routine tillage. And there's plenty of organic farmers that do almost no tillage and have incredibly beautiful soil health. We interviewed 2 farmers that could be organic for the new book, but neither of which is certified because of all the paperwork and the hassle and so forth that goes into it. But they're doing organic no-till vegetables. And they're really nutrient dense. They had some of the best soil we tested in our comparisons. So it can be done. But some of the early blowback that we've had with the new book was from some organic farmers who didn't like, one throwaway comment in there. But I think it would be advantageous for agriculture to start focusing more on soil health, or to create a new, and there's a challenge in terms of labels, of how do you define regenerative? There's a paper that actually came out last year in an academic journal identifying all the different definitions people have employed on what is regenerative. So there's some work to be done to try and solidify and land on a real definition that someone could see in a grocery store and go, oh, I know how this stuff was raised. Because what you want to know in the end is how your food was raised.
Yeah, well, let's tee one up here.
Yeah,
when we
should I
talk
give them
about-
the correct definition?
Yeah,
So the definition that we're touting of regenerative ag is farming and ranching in synchrony with nature to repair, rebuild, revitalize, and restore ecosystem functions, beginning with all life in the soil and moving to all life above the soil. And I haven't found anyone who can argue with that definition. And yeah. Well, it just so happens that this is a space. I have long been a believer that we do not need labels. You need to meet your farmer and rancher. And I tell people in our household, we try and eat pretty much only what we grow and raise, but we will buy organic if not for the same reasons as was mentioned here. But my business partners and I, we fought it for a long time, but we were tired of seeing the greenwashing that's taking place. People are making their regenerative claims, but in our minds it didn't meet the definition of being regenerative. As David said, we have to move forward. I am not in a position I don't believe it does anybody any good to pit one facet of agriculture against another. But last month at Expo West, my partners and I announced a new company called Regenified, and that is a verification company. So we're verifying that we're extremely inclusive on the bottom. It doesn't matter if you're organic, regenerative, conventional, anybody can apply. And then what makes this program so different is you are only compared to yourself. You have to have a plan to regenerate your soils on your farm, ranch, orchard, vineyard, whatever the case may be. The baseline work is all done, including carbon. It's probably the most comprehensive protocol out there of any of the verifications. You have to have a plan to move forward. What makes us different than if you're a longtime practitioner, you can automatically, once you pass and show that the principles are driving the processes, and you can prove that, then you can get the verification immediately. But here's the difference. You have to continually keep improving unless there was a catastrophic event, such as a flood or drought, etc. Because what happens with a lot of these verifications, they meet a hurdle and they just stop there. That's not regeneration. You have to keep improving. So the team goes back a year later, does another analysis. If you're progressing and you meet, the minimum standards, and they get more difficult every year. But think of it as an inverted funnel. We're very inclusive at the bottom, but we're doing just what David asked. How do we get organic with less tillage, okay? You're gonna do that under this system. So right now, we're getting a number. The other difference with Regenified is it comes back to the common ground for common good, and this is not gonna be the burden of the farmer or rancher to pay for. We're going to the companies, the supply chains, and those supply chains, because what do they need? They need a consistent supply of high quality products. They also need to meet their sustainability goals. What we're doing is telling those supply chains, okay, you have to go back, reward the farmer or rancher for what they're doing ecologically, environmentally, and nutrition-wise. And then, so give them a contract, reward them as they move up the tiers of this, and they got to pay for the baseline measurement. The farmer and rancher is incentivized to do better, okay? And doesn't matter, the carbon credits are the farmers and ranchers. They can work with any company, sell whatever they want to do. If they want to sell water, whatever the case may be. But see, it's all inclusive. It encompasses everything. We've already got a number of supply chains signed on. We have signed up more acres in 1 month than Regenerative Organic has since they've been in existence, okay? We're on the verge of getting approval from several major companies, and when we get that, the dominoes will really start falling.
Can I speak to that some? You know, when something really exciting happens, you get those tingles up your back. That's me right now. So I've never met Gabe yet, and so this isn't planned. Nice to meet you. Yeah. I did shake his hand before. So everything you just talked about is the way that and it's not, I don't want this just to be about our model, but the way our model works is just like that, where we work with the farmer or rancher, they commit to practices that they're going to change too, and then we work with them over time with their agronomist or themselves or whoever, and I don't care what it's called, and then they commit to those changes of practice, and every, about 8 times a year we visit with them, how's it going, and where are you struggling with? And then the measurement of the soil carbon increase, you talked about the supply chain having to come back and reward them. Well, that's the reward that they get because whoever's at the end of that supply chain could be a food processing company or a retailer. It could be an energy company. It could be a technology company. And they're paying for the environmental goods and service that farm is generating. And it's a measured carbon in the soil. And they don't have to be certified organic or regenerative or I built a model that talks about the third way, whatever that happens to be, whether that's how you eat or produce your food. But that's how, to validate that and to measure that, and it sounds like the way your model works is that it's an ongoing commitment and a verification that, hey, here's what you said you're going to do, and are you still doing that?
Yeah, exactly. And I want to add one other thing. My partners and I firmly believe if we do this right, that verification should go away in the future, okay? We believe that as we change landscapes, and as Jason, who said it, we need to make regenerative the conventional model, okay? That's our goal. We want to do away with it, but move it forward so we common ground for common good.
Yeah, I like how John Kemp says it, where he's like, in my mind, something like this, I'm not quoting him exactly, but regenerative will be the system that all farming systems will be measured against in the future. And I think that's a really interesting concept. But, we've got to do something to communicate this at the consumer level. One of the things that organic has done a really good job at is harnessing consumer momentum and clearly articulating value. And that's something that I think the regenerative movement should look to as far as like a benchmark, because you look at fair trade coming out of the last 3 decades, very multiple entities doing verifications, no cohesive collaboration between those verifications, and it really slowed the momentum of fair trade as a widely recognized consumer benchmark. And there are actual economic studies that look into this and give like a financial impact on the momentum of companies that were embracing that as part of their central value proposition. So I think that this whole certification, I love the work that Gabe and his team are doing. It's really exciting. And the next level is like, really, how do we get this on the package? Like, how do we start telling consumers what's going on? And things like carbon can be quantitative indicators of a qualitative improvement in the food quality. And that's a powerful notion. It's a very powerful notion, but this is like the Wild West. So of course it's like, there's gonna be a lot of sorting out, but it's exciting.
Well, I think with that, is there any burning questions out here as we wrap up? Go ahead.
Yell it out. It seems like the word regenerative has just taken off in the last decade, maybe even less than that. And it's already been hijacked by legacy ag corporations. It's more of a farmer-oriented question, but I struggle with how we might make sugar beets regenerative, because white satin sugar is not valuable to human health. But they're attempting to make their practices regenerative, and they're incorporating Roundup. So I just want to know how we get to the other side of the word regenerative that mirrors organic, that is soil health, that left chemicals, left petrochemical agriculture behind. Like, I don't know if it's a question, but I see it all the time where we're going to make climate smart commodities, but they're not smart commodities in the first place.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And the fact of the matter is, with the Regenified verification process, that weeds that out very quickly as they want to move up the tiers. But that's the reason we started this verification process, is just because of what you said. It was being hijacked. And we were going, no, this really isn't truly regenerative.
And I think that any system that regularly uses glyphosate is not regenerative de facto. Now,
I spent a year, part of my 4 times last year, on a regenerative ag lab where there was a bunch of producers and academics and folks trying to figure out that very thing, like what is regenerative ag and what do we do to protect it, and it's being greenwashed. And my perspective on that was a little bit. It's not that I don't care, but what I do care about is that from a producer point of view, that we help producers that want to follow that practice. How do we support them? How do we make sure they get access to the capital that they need and the revenues that they need, and promote that? And I know, like, there's not much we can do, and I think it sounds like the Regenify maybe is a way to help combat the risk of greenwashing, but it's up to all of us in this room to practice that and to figure out ways to let consumers know that they see value in it, to build relationships with the people that are buying our food so that you get to see them eye to eye. That's not the only way, but I think that's one way to help avoid the greenwashing of regenerative. And I don't know if there's a way to actually get ahead of that, because there's a lot of money being spent out there by big companies that want to make all these claims around what they're doing. And I think the best way to do it is to verify it and to measure it.
So from the standpoint of a consumer and policy, do you foresee a certification process? If so, how do you insulate that process from influence by those who would change it?
Well, I don't think at this point in time it's going to be able to be dictated by the government. You know, it's very difficult to get a person to change their mind when their paycheck depends on the status quo. And so at this point in time, that's why we believe it had to come from the private sector, so there is control over it. And we're absolutely right. You're not going to be able to dictate. It's going to have to be policed by the consumers, and come from education and educating them. But you've got to start somewhere. You have to start somewhere.
And so with that, I got to thank our sponsors real quick. PowerNot, we got to thank Digester Doc, Swish, Idaho, the Camille Beckman Foundation, the Chateau. We have ZagTech, we have Carbon Assets Solutions. They made this event possible, and thank you guys so much for coming out. Like, this is ideally an annual event. We're actually going to have a follow-up event in the fall, October 4th. So if you'd like to RSVP for that now, you can. And so go ahead and fill out those surveys if you'd like to come see us in the fall. And so again, let's give it a round of applause for our panelists here. We could sit up here all day, but I think we have a lot to think about already today. So go home and digest that. And again, thank you so much for coming out today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.
We should make sure to thank this guy for all the work that he's done for getting us all together.
So I guess I gotta make one more announcement. For those of you who signed up for the next segment of the Carbon Summit, it's at Boise State in the Lookout Ballroom. So we're celebrating an evening of climate solutions, and it's really geared towards the students. Tomorrow we're giving away $20,000 in our Carbon Venture Challenge. So we've tasked the students to raise the Sustainability Index score at Boise State, which is a dismal 49 out of 100. And so we're the lowest in the region, and that, U of I is 10 points higher. University of Washington is 20-some points higher. So we need to work on these things. These are things that are pressing issues, and they need to be done. And so we're excited if you guys are going there. We'll see you there. And so until next time, thank you so much.